Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, all of you. First of all, I request all of you to kindly stand up for ISA flag hosting.
May I request all of you to please stand for the IS.
Thank you. We extend a warm welcome all of attendees. And Mr. Amya, can you run the PPT of introduction? I would like to introduce, first of all office bearers of ISA and ISA Delhi. Amya? So, first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Rajiv Gupta, Governing Council, North ISA National. Dr. Nikki Sabharwal, President, ISA Delhi Chapter. Dr. G. Usa, Vice President, ISA Delhi Chapter. Dr. Umesh Kumar Desmukh, Secretary, ISA Delhi Chapter. Dr. Anu Vijayant Goyal, Treasurer, ISA Delhi Chapter. Dr. Parul Malik, Editor, ISA Delhi Chapter. Dr. Arvind Arya, Governing Council, East Zone, Delhi, ISA Delhi. Dr. Arun Mehra, GC West Zone. Dr. Amit Kohli, GC Central Zone. Dr. Ashish Jang, GC North Zone. And Dr. Ranju Gandhi, GC South Zone. Now I request Dr. Nikki Sabharwal ma'am to for office bearer message.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to everybody, dear friends. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's ISA clinical meeting being hosted by the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, under the able guidance of HOD Dr. Rajeshwari Subramaniam. 4 very interesting presentations have been lined up for today's meeting, and we are all looking forward to hearing these. AIMS has been one of the major hospitals and leaders in the COVID pandemic, and none other than Dr. Rajeshwari herself will be sharing the contributions of her department in the COVID-19 pandemic. So, madam, we are really looking forward to listening to the major contributions that your department and hospital have made. I request Dr. Rajeshwari and her team to kindly submit abstracts of today's presentations for publication in this month's e-news bulletin, and also some screenshots and photographs would be welcome. I wish to inform everyone that the tentative dates for the ISA Delhi annual conference have been decided as the last weekend of September, that is the 25th and the 26th of September. As you know, the present office bearers will hand over charge on 16th October during the World Anesthesia Day celebrations. This has been decided by our national body. The change of guard of all state branches office bearers would be 16th October with effect from this year. So I request you all to please take interest in proceedings of ISA Delhi and give suggestions for our annual conference. We would like, the not only the suggestions but also active participation of all the Delhi hospitals and medical colleges. So thank you very much. Long live ISA and ISA Delhi. Jai Hind.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Now I like to invite Rajeswari ma'am to conduct scientific session of this monthly meeting.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Nikki, for your very kind and, as usual, very worthwhile comments. So they will all help us to look forward and to feel very proud of our specialty. So we begin today's scientific program with a study on the mapping of cortical activity in children with near-infrared spectroscopy to determine if there is any etiopathogenetic reason of emergence delirium in them. And Dr. Nirmal, who's the junior resident of final year, and Dr. Puneet Khanna, our associate professor, will be presenting this study. So can I have the first presentation, please?
Amen.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we would be presenting a study on the mapping of the frontal cortex during sevoflurane anesthesia in children using functional near-infrared spectroscopy and correlation of the changes in the frontal cortex with emergence delirium in the postoperative period. Emergence delirium is a transient state of marked irritation and dissociation after the discontinuation of anesthesia. The reported incidence is 18 to 30%. Numerous risk factors have been postulated for the cause of emergence delirium, namely patient, surgical, and anesthesia-related risk factors. There are multiple consequences of emergence delirium, including self-inflicted injury, disruption of the surgical wound and sutures, prolonged hospital stay, and parental dissatisfaction. Hence, it is important to diagnose emergence delirium early. The anesthetic agents alter the balance between excitatory and inhibitory pathways and affect cortical networks involved in higher order processing. The neurodevelopment in children is also immature and they have lesser control over the cognition. Hence, the question arises, does sevoflurane lead to altered cerebral blood flow in the cerebral cortex, and could that possibly be a cause of emergence delirium? And is it possible to recognize emergence delirium intraoperatively? Functional near-infrared spectroscopy is an optical neuroimaging modality based on the modified Beer-Lambert law and utilizes light in the near-infrared region from 700 to 2500 nanometer. By using multiple sources and detectors, we are able to produce sequential activation images of the cortical area that it covers. This is an image depicting the use of the FNIRS in the children in our study. And this image shows multiple sources and detectors which are placed on the head of the child. The FNIRS works on the BOLD response, as in the blood oxygen level dependent response. This means that if a particular area of the brain is activated, the blood supply to that region increases. And if a particular region of the brain is deactivated, the blood supply to that region decreases. This is shown on this spectrum, which shows the highly activated cortex on the red end of the spectrum and a highly deactivated cortex on the blue end of the spectrum. The study was a prospective observational study, the primary objective of which was to assess FNIRS recordings in children undergoing sevoflurane anesthesia and correlating the changes with the postoperative emergence delirium. We also had a secondary objective to correlate blood glucose, serum electrolytes, and preoperative anxiety scores with emergence delirium in the postoperative period. Children of 2 to 5 years of age, both male and female, undergoing ophthalmic examination under sevoflurane anesthesia were included, and children who had a history of perinatal hypoxia, preterm delivery, seizure disorders, developmental delays, and children whose parents refused to consent were excluded from the study. A total of 153 children were included in the study population. They underwent routine pre-anesthetic checkups with particular attention to fasting guidelines and history of URI. the MI-PASS scale was given. Can I do this again? Yeah. The children were evaluated using the MI-PASS, the modified Yale preoperative anxiety score for preoperative anxiety, and which included 5 components, that is activity, vocalizations, emotional expressivity, a state of apparent arousal, and the use of parents. After this, a standard ASA monitors were attached, and the opt-out cap was attached to the child's head, and baseline FNIRS readings were obtained. Induction was done with oxygen sevoflurane, and IV access was obtained, from which samples were taken for serum electrolytes and blood glucose. And after this, an AMRO LMA of appropriate size was placed. Maintenance was done using oxygen, nitrous, and sevoflurane at 1 mag. And after this, the ocular examination was done. At the end of the procedure, sevoflurane was switched off and 100% oxygen was administered. The LMA was removed and emergence delirium was assessed every 5 minutes for the next 30 minutes. The emergence delirium was assessed using the PED scale, which contained 5 components with a minimum score of 0 and a maximum score of 20. And a score of greater than or equal to 12 was taken to be diagnostic of emergence delirium. This image shows the FNIRS montage setup on the head of the child, which with the anterior part showing the face and the posterior part showing the occiput, and the sources and detectors, which were, can I do this again? Yeah. So the sources are the red dots and the detectors are the green dots, and these were placed on a predefined montage according to the 10-5 system. Time markers were placed at the start of induction, at the end point of induction, at the end of the procedure, and when the MAC reached 0.2. The time interval between the start of induction and the end point of induction was termed induction. The time interval between the end point of induction and the end of the procedure was termed maintenance. And the time interval between the end of the procedure and the point at which the MAC reached 0.2 was termed emergence. This image shows shows the FNIR setup with the computer running the FNIR star 15.2 software, which was attached to the transducer module, which then was attached to the sensor, which was then attached to the sources and detectors, which are placed on the cap, which was attached to the head of the child. Statistical analysis was done using SPSS version 22, and FNIRS data was analyzed using NIRS lab using statistical parametrical mapping. Data was lost for 145 patients. Data was lost for 8 patients, and out of which 145 patients were analyzed. Out of this, 59 children developed emergence delirium, contributing 40.7% of the population. Age and modified Yale preoperative anxiety scores showed positive correlation with emergence delirium. That is, a lower age and higher preoperative anxiety scores were associated with more emergence delirium. And serum electrolytes and blood glucose did not correlate with emergence delirium. During induction, in children who had emergence delirium, the left superior and the right middle frontal cortex was found to be significantly activated. And in children who did not have emergence delirium, the right middle frontal cortex was found to be significantly deactivated. During maintenance, in children who had emergence delirium, multiple areas in the prefrontal cortex was found to be deactivated, whereas in children who did not have emergence delirium, only the left superior frontal cortex was found to be deactivated. During emergence, we again found that the right superior frontal cortex and the medial cortex was found to be significantly activated, whereas in children who did not have emergence delirium, the right superior and middle frontal cortex was found to be deactivated. Now I call upon Dr. Puneet to discuss the findings.
Before coming to the discussion proper, let's explore the various ways where FNIRS can be used to postulate various areas of pathogenesis during induction, maintenance, and emergence. Which all areas are responsible for the emergence delirium, their activation or the disactivation. So during induction, the right middle frontal cortex, which contains the attention networks, was activated. The left superior frontal cortex, which is responsible for the working memory and spatially oriented processes, is activated. So what happens when the right middle frontal cortex is activated? Probably there is a sensory overload and excessive stimulation, which gets stored in the right middle frontal cortex, and any traumatic or frightening memories are stored in the left superior frontal cortex. During maintenance phase, the right superior frontal cortex and the bilateral medial cortex, they are depressed, which is quite usual with the normal anesthetic procedure. There are multiple areas which are depressed in ED positive patients. Right? During emergence, as we are told during induction, left superior frontal cortex, which is responsible for the working memory and spatially oriented processes memory, is again activated. Normally, the children should show depression in all these areas, implying there is a loss of memory and attention, which is quite essential to anesthesia. What happens actually is there is a switch from a highly activated induction phase to a highly deactivated maintenance phase in children, those who develop emergence delirium. This can be attributed to the low blood gas coefficient of sevoflurane. Children, those who developed emergence delirium, are more susceptible to these varying cortical activation and deactivation patterns. Reviewing the literature, EEG studies have told us about the frontal lobe functional activity and epileptiform discharges in the frontal cortex. This was highlighted in the papers by Martin et al. In Anesthesiology 2014 and by Koch et al. In European Journal of Anesthesia. FNIRS uses in anesthesia have been done in adults, and there has been found a good correlation between the electrical activity and the hemodynamic responses which occurs during sedation with propofol and midazolam. Where does the future takes us? What are the future applications? We can develop markers on FNIRS to detect the children which are more susceptible to ED, and we can manage our anesthesia based upon it. We can develop therapy targets for the aforementioned areas and use therapeutic targets for prophylaxis and the treatment of emergence delirium. Limitations. FNIRS machine, as you see, is anxiety inducing. The output appears similar to the spikes of a coronavirus. It creates anxiety among all of us, even the children. FNIRS cap with a chin strap may have some issues with airway management. Last but not the least, we could only analyze the prefrontal cortex and other cortical areas, and deeper structures like amygdala and hypothalamus were not covered. These are the unexplored areas which may give further information for which we need a functional MRI. Thank you.
So thank you, Puneet and Nirmal. So my request to all the attendees is to switch off their videos so that their video does not come on to the screen. And secondly, I would request all of you to write down your questions and then subsequently put them on the chat box so that they can be answered at the end of the session. So we will now go on to the next presentation, which is on the comparison of erector spinae plain block with local infiltration for pain control in patients undergoing video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery. And this is being presented by Dr. Ramesh Roof, junior resident in our department, and Professor Lokesh Kashyap, who is the moderator. So over to Dr. Ramesh. Can I have the next presentation, please, Amir?
Good afternoon. I would like to present a study comparison of analgesic efficacy of erector spinae plain block versus local infiltration in bats. Video-assisted thoracoscopy surgery is a minimally invasive procedure for the diagnosis and treatment of thoracic disease. It involves a small incision for providing adequate visualization of the structures. Over the past few years, it has replaced open thoracotomy in many procedures due to the development of miniature video equipment and surgical staplers. The advantages of VATS over conventional thoracotomy include less morbidity, supposedly lesser amount of pain, early recovery, shorter stay, and better cosmesis. However, even with VATS, there is acute pain in the postoperative period, which may affect the perioperative outcome. Effective management of pain in these patients helps in hastening the recovery, improves the patient outcome, and also helps to reduce the hospital costs. Pain management in VATS, we have a multimodal approach when it comes to analgesia. This includes systemic analgesics in the form of opioids, paracetamol, NSAIDs, local infiltration at the site of the port insertion, and regional techniques of anesthesia, which include paravertebral block, epidural, and newer modalities such as facial plain blocks. This figure illustrates the surgical incision in VATS and how it is quite different from that of an open thoracotomy. Thoracic epidural is considered to be the gold standard for analgesia in open thoracotomy. However, the question arises, do we really need such a method for such a minimally invasive surgery, taking into consideration the expertise required for performing a thoracic epidural and the adverse events associated with it? With the use of ultrasound in the operating room, newer modalities for combating pain have been developed, such as the erector spinae plain block. And so the present study is to compare the analgesic efficacy of erector spinae plain block and local infiltration in patients undergoing VATS. This is a representation of the insertion of ports in VATS. So we here have a cross-section of the thorax showing the nerve supply of the thorax. So the epidural, which is considered to be the gold standard in open thoracotomy, is performed in close proximity to the central neuraxis. We have developed newer techniques such as the paravertebral block, which is slightly moving away from the central neuraxis. And the newer modality, that is the facial plain block, such as the erector spinae plain block, which has further moved away from the neuraxis. The idea is to provide adequate analgesia. As we move away from the neuraxis, the adverse events also reduce. In the erector spinae plain block, we inject a drug deep to the erector spinae muscle. The point of needle insertion is at the transverse process. And once the transverse process is hit, the needle is slightly withdrawn and the drug is injected. This local anesthetic agent which is injected, it traverses the costotransverse ligament and it moves towards the area surrounding the intervertebral foramina, anesthetizing the dorsal and the ventral rami, providing adequate analgesia. This ultrasound image represents the erector spinae plain block being performed. We can see the transverse process here. The needle is approaching from the craniocaudal direction. Once it hits the transverse process, it's slightly withdrawn and the anesthetic agent is deposited. This was a prospective randomized single-blind study. The primary objective was to assess the analgesic efficacy in terms of PCA morphine consumption over a period of 24 hours, the first use of PCA device, and VAS at rest and during movement at 0, 4, 8, 12, and 24 hours. The secondary objective of the study was to assess the intraoperative hemodynamic parameters. The incidence of adverse events such as P1B, pruritus, respiratory depression, and hypotension were also noted. Patients above the age of 18 years scheduled to undergo elective VATS of ASA grade 1 and 2 were selected for the study. On the day of surgery, standard preoperative instructions were followed, ASA standard monitoring were applied, and anesthesia was induced with propofol, fentanyl, and atracane. This was followed by the insertion of a double lumen tube. The position of it was confirmed by bronchoscopy. Anesthesia was maintained with isoflurane in an oxygen-air mixture, maintaining a MAC of 1 to 1.2. Following this, the patients were randomized into two groups. Patients allotted to group B received erector spinae plain block with 20 ml of 0.375% ropivacaine with adrenaline at T4 level. Patients allocated to group L received the same amount of drug as local infiltration at the port site prior to insertion of the ports. This video represents the erector spinae block technique. We can see the transverse process here, and the needle is moving from the craniocaudal direction. The three muscles are visualized. Once the needle approaches the transverse process, it hits the process and is slightly withdrawn, following which the drug is administered. Once the local anesthetic is administered, we can observe the muscle plane being lifted. In the intraoperative period, IV paracetamol 15 mg per kg was administered, along with fentanyl boluses of 0.5 microgram per kg if the systolic blood pressure or heart rate was more than 20% of the baseline. In the postoperative period, the patients received PCA. Morphine boluses of 1 mg was provided at the lockout interval of 10 minutes and the maximum dose of 20 mg in 4 hours. The following data were collected during the course of study. Appropriate statistical methods were used for analyzing the data. P-value of less than 0.05 was taken to be statistically significant. A total of 30 patients were randomized into 2 groups, group B and L. 15 were allocated in each group. All the patients were analyzed. The demographics between the 2 groups were found to be comparable. The VAS score at rest and at movement were assessed. It was found that the VAS at rest and movement was found to be significantly lower in the group which was administered the erector spinal plane. The time for first use of PCA was found to be around 7 hours in group B, whereas it was found to be around 1 hour in group L. The total PCA morphine consumption was also found to be significantly lower in group D. The adverse events were also noted during the course of the study, and it was found that the incidence of nausea was found to be significantly higher in group L. The quality of recovery among the patients were recorded using a POR15 questionnaire, and it was found that group B patients had a better quality of recovery. Now I would like to invite Dr. Lokesh to continue with the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh. For VATS, as Dr. Ramesh has said, a multimodal analgesia is needed. Conventionally, paravertebral block has been commonly used in the Western literature, but there has been no gold standard because the pain is usually much less than a thoracotomy pain. Advent of ultrasound-guided interfacial blocks have made multimodal analgesia even more relevant nowadays. This is a study in which during VATS surgery, this erector spinae plane block was given, in which 30 patients received block while there were another 30 patients which are in the control group. And it was found that PCA fentanyl consumption during the first 24 hours was much lower in the erector spinae plane block group. Also, the VAS and rest at rest and during movement was significantly lower in the block group. So they concluded that preemptive single shot erector spinae plane block may provide effective analgesia following VATS surgery. Another study done in 2019 where serratus plane block was compared with erector spinae block, and 60 patients were studied, and they found that the erector spinae plane block patients had a much lower static VAS score as well as during movement, and the time for first analgesic requirement was also significantly delayed in this group. But however, the serratus anterior block was not found to be as effective because probably it affects only the nerve supplying the anterior chest wall. Another study done in our center here in cardiac patients found that use of erector spinae block resulted in a much higher duration of analgesia of 8.9 hours. And it was concluded that during cardiac anesthesia, also these pain blocks provide a significantly longer pain relief compared to IV paracetamol and tramadol. This is another study done in regional anesthesia and pain medicine in which erector spinae block was compared with paravertebral block, and they found that the analgesic effect of block was non-inferior to thoracic paravertebral block given in these patients. However, the popularity of erector spinae block can be seen by the fact that even the surgeons have started appreciating that erector spinae block is good, especially with the use of ERAS protocol. They have found that there has been a decreased narcotic usage, less complications, the hospital stay is decreased, and it is a useful adjuvant in the armamentarium for analgesia in these patients to avoid or to decrease the requirement of opioids. So it has been found to be safer than paravertebral block. Injections and placement of catheters is associated with less adverse events like epidural hematoma, retention, and hypertension seen commonly with spinal anesthesia or epidural anesthesia. Also, it is easier and safer in coagulation defect patients, and there is less risk of neurological injury if it is done in a patient under general anesthesia. There are lower West Coast, less consumption of opioids, and a longer duration for first years of PCA, along with less instance of nausea and vomiting. So, ultrasound-guided electrospinal block is a safe, effective, and reliable alternative as part of a multimodal analgesia and can be considered in patients undergoing thoracic surgery, adding a useful armamentarium of the already available analgesic techniques. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Lokesh and Dr. Ramesh. So I'll be presenting a brief review of the COVID care work which was done in the main hospital in AIIMS. This is will not be covering the enormous amount of work done in the main COVID hospital, which is the trauma center, and Jhajjar, which had their own teams working there. And I will be giving you a brief resume of what went on in the main hospital, along with work in the routine work as well. So Amaya, can I have the presentation, please? Good afternoon to all of you. So 2020 was a year which many of us would actually prefer to forget. But there were some things which happened in 2020 which will always remain in our memories for a long time to come. And one of these was the enormous contribution of our specialty, that is the specialty of anesthesia, to COVID care all around the world. I'm sure what I'm going to present has been actually mirrored in all hospitals, but I'm just going to present you a snapshot of what was happening in our hospital in the last 8 months regarding our department. So when the pandemic started at that time, the hospital identified 3 main areas for COVID care, and all the 3 areas were managed by senior anesthesiology faculty. So this included the trauma center, which was the designated COVID hospital, Jhajjar, which was supposed to be a COVID center for mild cases, and in the main hospital on the 6th floor ward block, we had the wards C and D. So C and D 6 wards were actually designated as the COVID care wards in the main hospital, for which we actually kept a designated COVID lift and a COVID corridor for shifting these patients carefully without any contamination. So the first thing we had to do was to restructure these wards, which were actually emergency medicine wards, into COVID areas. So we first identified the patient areas and nurse stations in these wards. Then with the cooperation of the engineering department, we had to place partitions and doors, install window ACs, exhaust fans, and close off the central AC. And then we created new doffing areas with supplies. We mapped the footfall of personnel to ensure that there was isolation of COVID ward personnel from infected patients. And a very exhaustive list of equipment, including ICU equipment, drug inventory, which included computers, internet connection, and landline. And last but not the least, teaching infection control practices to all cadres of personnel who were going to work in this ward. And for this, we had a very small timeline of only 10 days. So after 10 days, this is what one of the wards looked like. So in the central area was the ward area. So let me just get a pointer here. So this central area, the patients were actually nursed in the central area. The nurses station was also in the central area, and the donning area and the doffing area were kept on either side of the patient area. And the exit and entry of healthcare workers was delineated from the patient's entry and exit so that there was no mixing. Then further to this, after our area was ready, then we were given the complete responsibility of admissions, the clinical care and transfers of patient into this ward. There were other responsibilities as well. One of them was sampling, which was RT-PCR or CPNR 2 to 3 times a day at designated times. We had to also ensure the quality and quantity of PPEs and supplies. There was networking to do with departments for transfer of their patients. We had to coordinate with ambulance for transfer of patients to trauma center. Every day, daily uploading of COVID data on the portal, communication with attendants and facilitating video calls. and a good shift, 5-shift duty roster with adequate rotation to prevent fatigue in the workers. But I think the most important thing which actually turned around and gave us very good figures was a daily 2 to 3 hour round by 2 dedicated anesthesiology faculty. And they did it every day for the last 8 months and without any missing. So one of these wards, the C6 ward, it had 2 phases. The first phase was the beginning of the pandemic, March 1st to July 27th, when it functioned as a COVID suspect area. So at this point in this period, all symptomatic patients who had a suspicion of COVID were admitted from the emergency department and tested. And this was a very varied population, not only just adults, but it included neonates, infants, and with a variety of diseases. There was congenital heart disease, CKD, COPD, liver disease, hepatic encephalopathy, and anything that you could think of. And once these patients underwent testing and were tested negative, then they were attempted to shift back to their own parent wards, and the positive patients were then shifted to the trauma center. Then later on, at the same time, we were developing the D6 ward also. So in the next part of the August to December part, this C6 ward became a non-COVID ICU to house all the non-COVID critically ill patients who landed from the emergency department who could not get a bed in their own parent wards. So a few numbers. So in the phase 1, in the C6 ward, there were 928 admissions with 168 positives. We managed to transfer about 95 to the COVID hospitals, but C6 continued to nurse 73 very sick COVID patients who were hemodynamically unstable and who required mechanical ventilation till they recovered or till they died, and also 760 critically ill non-COVID patients who were managed till their extubation. And all this was done just with 12 beds. So you can imagine the high turnover that was happening there every day. In phase 2, when C6 became the non-COVID ICU, there were 241 patients admitted who were mainly derived from the emergency department and from D6 after being declared COVID negative. Mainly they comprised of medicine patients and geriatric medicine, followed by other specialties. And again, this was going on in these 12 beds. In these 240 patients, nearly half of them were on mechanical ventilation, about 20% were on high flow nasal cannula, and about 16% required NIV, and nearly 40% were on vasopressors. Percutaneous tracheostomy was done on 21 of these patients. These were all COVID negative patients, and we had very good survival figures in this ICU. Nearly 75% survived to ICU discharge, and there was a 55% survival rate on patients who were on mechanical ventilation. Now, all this while, the other ward, D6, which I had shown you earlier, was getting ready, and D6 from May to December 2020 admitted 2,200 patients in 28 beds. So amongst these patients, we had some early deaths in the first 24 hours. We could also have some early transfer of people who were mildly ill or moderately symptomatic to the trauma and the Jhajjar. And amongst the remaining patients, a large majority, 461, remained with us till they become stable enough for transfer. This included patients who were hemodynamically stable, who required dialysis immediately, or who required high levels of PEEP or were prone. And the majority of patients remained with us in D6 ward. There were a few deaths among the COVID as well as the non-COVID patients. And then as a final record, there were about 1,700 patients who were actually treated with a 30% positivity rate in this ward by our same batch of faculty. And this was done with 28 beds. Amongst the COVID patients, nearly 17% required mechanical ventilation, and of these, half required prone position ventilation. And as you can see, they had a very, very poor PF ratio. The mean PF ratio was about 65. They were severely hypoxemic. A large majority also required high flow nasal oxygen and non-invasive ventilation. Some of them required this for a very prolonged duration. The longest duration of HFNC was 26 days. Many invasive procedures were done in both wards. Intubations exceeded 1,000. Placement of dialysis access catheter was done by the anesthesia faculty and the anesthesia residents, more than 150. Central and arterial lines numbered more than 500. Percutaneous tracheostomy, 46. And all this was done with the constraint and suboptimal conditions imposed by wearing PPE and wearing goggles. You can see the fogging of the goggles in the pictures which are given. This is just a snapshot of the percutaneous tracheostomy procedure. It was done in 25 COVID positive patients and 21 COVID negative patients. Strict apnea protocol was observed. And there were no procedural complications in any of these procedures, like pneumothorax or bleeding or hypoxemia. And 10 COVID patients who were tracheostomized in D6 survived to ICU discharge. Now, it was not just clinical work that was being done by our team here. An enormous amount of research was being planned and being carried out. So this was one of the papers published in Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine on lung ultrasound in COVID, where we laid down criteria of the incidence of finding air bronchograms and V lines in COVID patients. Then there was another study done on prone ventilation, which showed that on the initiation of proning, there was a reduction in the plateau pressures, peak pressures, and driving pressures. And if the static compliance did not improve to more than 14, it was a good predictor of no response to proning. This paper won the Best Young Scientist Award in the current Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine conference held recently, 2 weeks back. This study is under peer review. This was done in patients who were awake prone or repositioned in the lateral position, and to see the effect of oxygenation. And if we found that awake 4-hour prone position was comparable with repeated position change, which is comfortable for certain patients. This study, which compared NIV and HFNC in severely ill COVID patients, will be presented to you briefly. But as a result of so much of research, we could actually publish 8 publications in peer-reviewed journals. I just listed them here. So these are the presentations or the publications which went. And with this, I come to the end of our snapshot of the COVID work which we've been doing. And behind the scenes, much more work of doing all the non-COVID emergencies, non-COVID surgeries, trauma surgeries, and the list is endless. I'm sure all of you have done an equal amount of work in all your hospitals. So with this, I end my presentation. Thank you. We now come to the last presentation, which is come out of the work done in the COVID ward. And this is a comparative study between high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive ventilation in severely hypoxic COVID patients, being presented by Dr. Harita, who's our senior resident, and Dr. Dalim, who's our additional professor. Amaya, can I please have the presentation, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. I will be presenting a randomized control trial comparing high flow nasal oxygen and NIV in acute hypoxemic respiratory failure due to severe COVID-19 pneumonia. December 2019 has marked its presence in the evolution of mankind due to a novel coronavirus by name SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan, China. As we all are aware, the presentation of the virus was between mild asymptomatic phase to acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. The main modalities of oxygen therapy available were face mask, high flow nasal oxygen, non-invasive ventilation, and invasive mechanical ventilation. Early experience with COVID-19 patients showed a very high mortality of 90% in intubated patients. As shown by the Florali trial in the pre-COVID era, high flow nasal oxygen and non-invasive ventilation may avoid or delay intubation and reduce mortality in such patients. Due to the limited data in COVID-19 patients treated with non-invasive ventilation and high flow nasal oxygen, we decided our research hypothesis to be high flow nasal oxygen, reducing the requirement of invasive mechanical ventilation in severe COVID-19 pneumonia in comparison to non-invasive ventilation. The primary objective of the study was to know the proportion of patients requiring intubation at 48 hours. The secondary objectives measured were proportion of patients requiring intubation at 7 days, and improvement in oxygenation based on the peripheral oxygen saturation and PF ratios at 2 and 24 hours, and in-hospital mortality rate. It was a single-center prospective randomized control trial conducted between August 2020 to December 2020 at the designated COVID-19 ICU at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. The sample size was calculated from the previous data from H1N1 pandemic, wherein 75% of the patients on non-invasive ventilation required mechanical ventilation. We assumed the reduction in intubation rate by high flow nasal oxygen by 30%, for the power of the study to be 80% and a two-sided alpha error of 0.05, and considering a dropout rate of 10%, at least 104 patients were recruited for the study. All the patients between the age of 18 and 75 years of age of either gender with lab-confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19 infection and severe COVID-19 pneumonia with failure of face mask therapy were included in the study. Randomization was done via the computer-generated random number table into two groups. Group A, high flow nasal oxygen group, and the other group with NIV. Allocation concealment was done via sealed envelope technique, and the patient and clinical management team were not blinded. An independent investigator who is unaware of the group allocation was involved in the data collection. In the patients who were assigned to group A, high flow nasal oxygen was delivered via large bore binasal cannula with an initial settings of FiO2 1 and flow of 60 liters, which were down titrated to a target SpO2 of more than 94%. In the other group, non-invasive ventilation was delivered through ICU ventilator with an initial pressure settings of 10 to 20, PEEP of 5 to 10, and an FiO2 of 1 to 0.5 with a target SpO2 of more than 94%. All the other clinical management, such as radiological investigations, hematological investigations, monitoring, drug therapy, were done through standard institutional protocol. Awake prone positioning was encouraged as per the patient compliance, and invasive mechanical ventilation was started in any patient with his peripheral oxygen saturation less than 90% or respiratory rate more than 40 per minute for more than 30 minutes or any other indication for intubation present. All the statistical analysis were done via Stata 13 software, and the probability of death during hospital stay was analyzed using Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. This diagram shows the consort flowchart of the study. Of 145 patients analyzed for the study, a total of 109 patients were randomized into two groups, and there was no attrition till the end of the study. The baseline demographic parameters of both the groups were comparable. As we can see, the pH in the group B, that is non-invasive ventilation group, was significantly lower than that of group A, high flow nasal oxygen group. The baseline PF ratios of both the groups ranged between 100 to 115 per 115. Among the distribution of comorbidities, chronic kidney disease patients were much higher in non-invasive ventilation group compared to the high flow nasal oxygen group. Based on the results, intubation at 48 hours was comparable in between both the groups, but intubation at 7 days was significantly lower in high flow nasal oxygen group with an odds ratio of 0.6, and which remains statistically lower even after adjustment for incidence of chronic kidney disease and arterial pH, which were higher in non-invasive ventilation group. And there was no significant difference in the in-hospital mortality, but there was a significant trend towards the reduction in mortality during Kaplan-Meier analysis. The oxygenation parameters were comparable between both the groups. This graph shows the Kaplan-Meier survival analysis, wherein we can see that high flow nasal oxygen group patients have significantly higher survival rate than non-invasive ventilation group with a hazard ratio of 0.54. Now I call upon Dr. Darling for further discussion.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So in this randomized control trial, we compared HFNO versus NIV in severe COVID-19 pneumonia patients presenting with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure, and we had excluded all type 2 failures. The main observations were that there was no significant difference between the groups in early improvement in oxygenation or early intubation rate as early as 48 hours. However, there was significant reduction in the proportion of patients requiring invasive mechanical ventilation at day 7, and there was a significant trend towards reduction in the in-hospital mortality in the HFNO patients. So I would like to discuss the salient points on the light of two important trials. The first one was the Forali trial. It's a famous trial conducted in France and published in NEJM in 2015. This was done in patients presenting with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure, where HFNO, NIV, and conventional oxygen therapy were compared. There was no significant difference in the proportion of patients requiring mechanical ventilation by day 28 in any of these groups. However, when the patients were analyzed, the subgroup of patients with more severe hypoxia presenting with PF ratios of less than 200, then it was found that the HFNO arm had a significant reduction in the intubation rate. During COVID-19 pandemic also, a multi-center observational study was done in France where HFN and NIV were compared, and similarly, intubation rate was significantly low in HFNO patients compared to NIV. So this goes similar to our data also, where we observed that the late intubation rate by day 7 was significantly less in HFNO compared to NIV. If you remember that the Society of Critical Care Medicine also initially had recommended to prefer HFNO over NIV in the COVID-19 protocol. Now, the next question might come, why we chose to use day 7 intubation rate rather than the in-hospital intubation rate during the entire hospital stay. So there was an important small but multi-center trial published from China which showed that the patients who were put on HFNO or NIV could be weaned off by day 7. And the patients who subsequently underwent intubation and mechanical ventilation from HFNO or NIV had to be intubated in mean time of 8 days from the time of admission. So the trend shows that by the end of 1 week, the fate is almost decided. The patients who will go for intubation and mechanical ventilation and who could be weaned off from HFN or NIV. So following the similar trend, we observed that in our study also, by day 7, the intubation rate was significantly different between the groups. Now, another interesting point to note is that the majority of the patients in our study was significantly hypoxemic compared to the previous studies. Like the baseline PF ratios were 105 to 110 in the current study, whereas the Florali trial patients had PF ratio in the range of 150 to 160, and even the French multicenter trial in COVID patients had PF ratio of 130. Even with more severe hypoxemia, the proportion of patients requiring invasive ventilation in the current study was comparatively less. So this suggests that we practiced a higher threshold for intubation in the current study. We had predefined intubation criteria, and based on that, the higher threshold we practiced in the current study was probably right approach because the results are quite encouraging, and ultimately less number of patients required intubation. And another reason which prompted us to do so was that once these patients get intubated, they are so severely hypoxemic that they require prone ventilation, and quite a lot of nursing care and efforts are spent in the caring of these patients. So this kind of approach has already been adopted in certain resource-poor countries, as well as even in the resource-rich countries at the peaks of pandemics when there was shortage of adequately experienced staff in the ICU. As far as mortality is concerned, HFNO has been consistently shown to reduce mortality in various trials. Like Florali trial, there was significant reduction in mortality with HFNO. In the current study and another multi-center study I quoted from France, in both these studies there was a trend towards reduction in in-hospital mortality, which almost reached statistical significance. Now, why this observation has been reciprocated repeatedly? There are certain causes which we can postulate. One is that the patients who are on NIV tend to generate larger tidal volumes, and with change in the compliance of the patients, they may be prone to develop self-inflicted lung injury or ventilator-induced lung injury. Moreover, in the current study, we realized that the patients in the HFNO arm were very compliant to AVEC pronunciations, they could perform it, whereas the patients in the NIV could not really perform it well. Moreover, the patients in the NIV arm felt claustrophobic. There was some pressure injuries, and they requested repeated disconnections. Even they required disconnections of masks during feeding. So that could have led to loss of recruitment and subsequent hypoxias. There are various strengths of the studies, like it was a well-conducted randomized one with sealed allocation, and we had pre-specified intubation criteria, and all the patients were followed up completely till the end of hospital stay without any dropout. However, the important limitation was that this was a single-center study. So to conclude, high-frequency nasal oxygen does not reduce early intubation rate by 48 hours, but it reduces late intubation by day 7 compared to NIV in severe COVID-19 pneumonia patients presenting with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dalim and Dr. Harita. I think we have a question for Dr. Dalim. Dr. Nikki, if it's okay with you, can I ask Dr. Dalim to respond?
Yes, please, please, Dr. Rajeshwari.
Over to Dr. Dalim.
Hello. So there was a question that if the baseline differences in the incidence of CKD and arterial pH in the NIV group was taken into consideration while analyzing the primary outcome. Yes, we had done so. So if you remember the result slides, the primary outcome was not different, but the intubation rate by day 7, which was an important secondary outcome, was significantly less in the HFNO arm compared to NIV arm. And we adjusted this for the incidence of CKD as well as low arterial pH in the NIV arm, and even after adjustment, this remains statistically significant. We had presented the adjusted odds ratio also in the tables. It was 0.4 after adjustment.
So that was Dr. Dalim's reply. I don't think we have any other questions, at least till now. So these were the presentations for the day, Dr. Nikki and all the attendees. So I hope you enjoyed all of them.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rajeshwari, for an excellent clinical meet, as always, from your institution and department. And as you very rightly said, we all have really played a major role, all the anesthesiologists. And at Safdarjung also, we had a huge COVID center, the entire super specialty block. Hindu Rao had presented. Most of our institutions have taken the load, of COVID on our shoulders. And I think that has been the silver lining. While we used to be the heroes behind the curtains, like they used to always say, the anesthesiologist is behind the curtains. I think now every person in the world knows the importance and who are the corona warriors. And I think we have also learned a lot in terms of the different strategies that have been adopted in terms of ventilation, non-invasive, HFNO, etc., and the prone ventilation and all. And we have had the opportunity of using these techniques, much more than we were doing earlier. So this has been a tough year, but I think we have emerged victorious and we have gained a lot. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. Yes, most of many of the other hospitals have also shared their COVID experiences, and a lot of publication studies have also been conducted during this time by every institution. So thank you again. Thank you very much for a very, very nice.
So I just wanted to add a few lines that this was just the tip of the iceberg, and actually Jhajjar took care of about 7,000 patients in the trauma center, nearly 5,000. So all in all, there were about 15,000 patients who were taken care of. And then we were the only department to ask for and purchase the HFNC, and only we had the knowledge, the background knowledge of how to use it. Even now, most medical and surgical departments do not know how to operate or how to use all the utility of it. So as you rightly said, we have come to the forefront, but even then, I think there is a reluctance to give us credit. So that we have to, really know. And
doesn't matter. We have never worked for credit. We have worked for our results and our patients, and our work is speaking louder than any other credit that anybody can give us,
Yeah, it
so, at the end of the day, we are satisfied with the work and the contributions that we have made towards management of these COVID patients. So you're right, that was just the tip of the iceberg. But we know Jhajjar had the very big center, and your trauma center was also converted. Like our entire super specialty was converted into a COVID hospital, And of course, we were also managing in the emergency, in the ORs, in the obs and gynae. So yes, but I think we have learned a lot in the last year, and we should take away the positives. And I think we are doing that. And the public now knows about our specialty. So that is, credit enough for us. So thank you, all speakers and Dr. Rajeshwari, for a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. These are our residents, Dr. Nikki, who presented the.
Yeah, wonderful and very good. Very good studies, very good studies. Even the first one was so interesting, and yes, the last one too. And all the studies were very good. Yes.
Thank you very much, sir.
So much, and thank you. Lovely to see the residents too. Thank you.